Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying this virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, Scaling Law Firm Growth Through Intake Policies and Procedures, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct codes to receive credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also, in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about CLE credit, please send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we'll be happy to assist you. If you're watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the chat room since our presenters will be available to answer them at that time. Now, without any further delay, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Enjoy the program.
All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we are going to be talking about scaling law firm growth through intake policies and procedures. I'm super excited to chat with you today about this topic. It's absolutely imperative that every firm really focuses on this area, focusing on their policies and procedures. So before we get started, I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Michael Chasen. I am the general manager of Clio Grow. I was the former CEO and co-founder of Lexicata, which was the #1 intake and CRM software in legal. It was actually purchased by Clio about 2 years ago, so now I'm with Clio. I'm from Los Angeles. I did my law and MBA degrees at Loyola Marymount in LA, and I did my undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill. I've founded numerous different companies over the years. Most recently, the last two was a marketplace for law firms to connect with clients, as well as Lexicata. And I've got my buddy here, Saul Singer, who's going to quickly introduce himself.
I am Senior Legal Ethics Counsel at the DC Bar, in which capacity we handle approximately 3,000 ethics inquiries a year to DC lawyers and other lawyers. And I welcome you to take advantage of the service, either if you have a question based on today or anything else for that matter. My direct dial is 202-780-2768, 780-2768, and it's always particularly rewarding when after one of these presentations, someone calls and I say, you mean you actually believed me when I told you to feel free to do it. So I look forward to this presentation today with Michael. Thank you.
Hey, Saul, you made a big mistake. Now I've got your phone number. Now I can hit you up on the weekends to hang out. Saul has actually finally given up his attempt at pro basketball. He's a competitive basketball player still at the age of 68. He's an absolute stud. So I'm really excited for him to join us today as we walk through our presentation. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. So over the next hour, we're going to cover a lot of really important things. I've worked with tens of thousands of law firms, so I have the benefit of seeing from a treetop view how everyone works. What are the pros? What are the cons? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages of doing things a certain way? And my passion really is in terms of sales, law firm growth, and really building good internal processes for your firm. So the first off, what we're going to talk about is why are firms struggling right now? It's really important to kind of acknowledge the faults so you know what to fix. We'll kind of walk through how firms typically do their intake process and how they set up their intakes. And then what we'll do is talk about how do we break that down a little bit and how do we improve it? How do we set up what we call the intake funnel for your law firm to be optimized, to have the best retention rate, to have the best operational capacity for your firm, so that way you and your staff are utilized in the best way possible. We'll talk about automating every step of the funnel and figuring out what technologies to use. So I'll have tons of recommendations of different tools, tips, and tricks that you can use. And then we'll talk about analyzing and improving your funnel. And then last, obviously, what you're all here for, the CLE accreditation. So we'll give that info at the very end. So the problem I always get, so just a quick background on myself. So the first company I started was a company called LawKick. It was a marketplace for connecting lawyers and clients together, kind of like an Angie's List or a Yelp for lawyers, but you could actually connect and get hired through the platform. Constantly what I would have people do, whether during that company or afterwards, people would come to me and say, hey, Michael, I need to grow my firm. I need more money. So that's their problem. So how do they solve that problem? Well, they come to me and say, hey, Michael, if I only had more leads, more prospective clients, well, then I'd be rich, right? And then my law firm would really take off and then I'd be super successful. But what really ends up happening is you end up looking like this person right here, all fancy lawyer in your tuxedo, but you're flushing those leads right down the toilet. And then you get me, who ends up looking something like Macaulay Culkin from Home Alone, where I'm just exacerbated as how did I just give you all of these leads and how did you flush them right down the drain? So that's actually what my first company was doing. We were delivering leads to law firms. And the problem was law firms had no effective way of tracking, managing, and following up with those leads. So what ended up happening was we actually threw that business in the toilet and we said, okay, let's start Lexicata because we needed a way, which is now Clio Grow. We need a way for that to work. So obviously I'm very passionate about this. I've been working on this for the better part of a decade. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that you can do to make sure that you're not flushing your leads down the toilet. Because honestly, you need $0 in marketing spend to be able to grow your firm. You really need to start with your processes and your systems before you move on to acquiring leads and spending a ton of money on marketing. So talking about yourself, there's been some studies done, Bloomberg Law, a couple others. 62% of law firms say that their firm is increasing its focus on marketing and business development, right? And 63% say that they're going to increase their budget over the next year or two. Again, everyone, right? The majority of people, almost 2 out of 3 firms want to grow or invest in business development and marketing. The problem is they're doing it in a haphazard way that's going to just basically put money into a pot, or like they say, you know, putting water into a leaky bucket that's just going to come out the other side, which is a big waste for everyone. So kind of to give you the understanding, right? A lot of firms are maybe thinking about things backwards. They're thinking about how do I grow rather than how do I position myself for growth, right? So we're going to talk about this. 91% of firms cannot calculate their return on their marketing investments, right? And 94% of firms have no idea how much it costs to acquire new clients. That is a problem. You need to get your stuff in order before you start investing in marketing and investing in growth. So let's talk about kind of what you're doing right now, right? I've seen it all done. I've seen the notepad or the sticky pad on the desk. I've seen the sticky pad on the wall where it kind of looks like a beautiful mind where you've got 50 different things floating everywhere. I've seen the spreadsheets. I've seen people using their case management softwares to track their leads. I've seen everything under the sun, you name it, I've seen it. Most of it, not very great, right? Basically, what are the downsides of what you're currently doing right now? So when you're talking about building software, there are 2 things that they refer to as the front end and the back end. The front end is like what the clients see. The back end is what happens behind the scenes, right? So let's talk about the front end first. So first of all, we're talking about a poor client experience, right? We're talking about inefficiencies, right? I've been on the, when I started businesses, I've been on the legal receiving side multiple times. It's inefficient. You'll ask the same questions multiple times. You'll have me come into a meeting. I'll talk to 3 different people. I'll talk to an intake manager or an assistant at the very beginning. I'll tell them my problem. They'll schedule a meeting, and then the lawyer will ask me the very same questions that the assistant or the paralegal or the receptionist already asked me. That can be really frustrating. The analogy I kind of almost look at is think about when you call AT&T or your cable provider, and they say, please enter your 10-digit account number, and then you go and find it, and then you type in your account number. It says, please wait. Hey, thank you for calling AT&T. Can I get your 10-digit account number? And you're like, why the heck did I just type it in, right? It's just a very frustrating and annoying experience. And right off the bat, it already starts getting you thinking, do these people have their act together, right? And we all know that the cable companies do not have their act together, so you do not want to associate yourself with the cable company. So Poor client experience can be upfront. Bad communication is also a very common effect of having a poor intake system or without having a system in general. Response time. We're going to talk about this a million times during the next 45 minutes or so, how slow law firms typically are to respond to clients, right? Especially at the very beginning. There's a lot of misinformation. You're hearing different things from different people. There's no one source of truth. And then miscommunication. Oh, wait, what do you mean? I'm going to end up, I owe $1,000 for this. The person I talked to told me I was only going to pay 800. Oh, sorry, they're new. They don't know what they're talking about, right? There's all that kind of stuff where you kind of hear different things. So that's the first end, is kind of what the clients experience when you have a system that's not structured, efficient, and very, like a well-oiled machine, as they say. And then a lot of people say, well, okay, I don't care that much about the client experience. Well, at the very least, you should care about your experience, because your experience behind the scenes is costing you time, it's costing you heartache, and it's costing you money. And most importantly, it's costing you potentially your law firm culture in terms of your employees. So there's a lot of wasted time in terms of disorganization. Oh, what happened to that notepad? Oh, I know I had it somewhere on my desk, and then you're ruffling through papers. Or, oh, I know I had that somewhere saved in my system. I don't know where it is, right? It takes a lot of time. You also, those multiple same conversations where the receptionist is asking the same stuff as the lawyer. You're paying two people to get the same information, right? It's wasted time. Lost revenue. If you are disorganized, you have no idea how many firms, when we used to ask people at Clio Grow, what's the reason you're coming to use our software? A lot of times they will say, it's because I'm having leads fall between the cracks, right? I'm not following up with them. I'm not doing a good job of keeping track of them. Well, what you want to make sure that you do is that you want to make sure that every potential dollar that comes in the door, you're retaining them, right? So a lot of lost revenue. And then we got my buddy Saul here, who's going to be talking about, all the issues that come from not following the rules. And when you don't have a structured process in place, you're going to have more likelihood of malpractice issues, more likelihood of bar violations. So you want to make sure that you build your structure accordingly. And then we already talked about not being able to track your ROI, which is your return on investment on your advertising, as well as, again, lost revenue. So the question is, what do we do, right? So that's what we're here to talk about today. How do we fix this problem? So let's talk about what I call the intake funnel, okay? So I've come from multiple industries. I wasn't always in law. I've come from, different backgrounds. And the one true thing that you hear in pretty much every industry when it comes to sales is building your sales funnel, right? And this is exactly what it looks like. It starts with a big wide net at the top, and it whittles down until all you get is the customers at the very end. The problem is I see a lot of law firms who will flip this backwards, and they'll make the top of the funnel, AKA when the clients first reach out to you, we'll make that really skinny. So we'll put up tons of barriers to entry. You've got to fill out a 40-page form. You've got to book something on my website. You got to do this. You got to do that before you can talk to me. So it's important that you cast a really wide net. Now, I know what already some of you are thinking. You're sitting there being like, oh, what is this guy talking about? I work in employment discrimination. I get tons of, we call them schmageggies or like kind of looky-loos who are just kind of coming together and saying, hey, my boss was mean to me. I want to sue him. You don't want to talk to that person, right? So what I'm going to give you in terms of advice over the next bit of time is going to be general, okay? Every practice area is different. Your intake process and how you structure it is going to be different if you're a criminal offense firm versus if you're employment discrimination, okay? So keep that in mind, and you're still going to get bits and pieces no matter what of what's important. But this is what I was kind of talking about. When you're building your intake process, you want to weigh these things, right? We talked about the scales of justice. Well, imagine there are 5 little scales, and they're all about efficient, and they're all about building your intake process. So you want to weigh the pros and cons. Speed. So for instance, if you're a PI attorney, speed is really important. Why? Because they're not paying for your services, and there's tons of competition, and basically the first person that they talk to is usually the person that they hire. So you want to move fast. Same thing with criminal offense. If you get a DUI, for instance, in California, you only have 10 days to basically file something with the state, basically allowing you to keep your driver's license. Otherwise, you get it automatically revoked after 10 days. So speed is really important for those practice areas. Whereas if you're talking about divorce, estate planning, business in general, speed doesn't tend to be a massive issue. Sometimes people take multiple years to do their estate plan. So that speed isn't necessarily as important. Whereas the other ones, you want to factor in organization, scalability, which is the ability to basically go from 10 clients to 100 clients overnight without having to completely change your process. Conversion rate, right? We were just talking about that employment discrimination lawyer who wants to only retain 10% of people they talk to, whereas criminal defense, majority of the time, if they've got an issue and they've got money to pay for it, you're probably going to take them on depending on what kind of criminal law you do. And then again, efficiency. How efficient do you want the stuff to be behind the scenes? So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to build your funnel. So when I think about building the structure of your funnel, I think about kind of that plastic casing around the funnel, that slide that I showed you earlier, kind of the outside. Like, how do you structure it? Do you have it higher, like wider at the top, skinnier at the bottom, skinnier at the top, wider at the bottom? How do you do it? And the first thing that you always got to take into consideration, which Saul is going to talk to you about momentarily, is about the ethics side of things.
So anytime you face an ethics question or you have an ethics issue, the first issue always has to be which ethics rules apply. And as we'll see in a moment, that becomes particularly important for a DC lawyer. Let's take a step back. The first question on intake, or soon thereafter, really better be whether there's an impending statute of limitations. Because a lawyer, even a lawyer who does intake and hasn't quite yet signed up the client, has to learn pretty quickly if there's an impending statute that would adversely impact the client one way or another, even if the lawyer doesn't take the case. But other than that, first question always has to be which substantive law applies, because we have a technical legal term for a lawyer who, let's say, applies Florida rules when it should be the Virginia rules that apply. We call that malpractice. Similarly, in the ethics realm, the first question has to be which ethics rules apply. And as I say, that's particularly important for a DC lawyer because as you may or may not know, DC is different. We are not a model rule state. We do not follow the ABA rules. In fact, the ABA rules have no applicability anywhere except to the extent that a particular jurisdiction may have adopted them, which we have not. And it's always scary when someone calls me with a question based on following the ABA rules, and it turns out our rule is different and they've done the wrong thing. So the first rule always, always, always has to be Rule 8.5, which is the choice of ethics rules provision. And we're not going to go into that now because it's extensive and it can be complicated. I just want you to be very aware of it. Just one rule, and this is the easy case, Rule 8.5B1 says that if you are before a tribunal, as very broadly defined, not just a court, but if you are before a tribunal, then it's going to be the rules of the jurisdiction in which the tribunal sits that control. So even if you're a DC lawyer and you are before, let's say, a California tribunal, you're going to be bound by the California rules, and you better know that, and you better know what the California rules are. Now let's talk for just a moment about the funnel, which Michael is talking about, and the intake process and the rules that are applicable there. In particular, we need to start with Rule 1.6. Rule 1.6 is the duty to maintain client confidences and secrets. It is extremely broad in the District of Columbia. And just standing on one foot now, let's just say that it extends not only to attorney-client communications, which everybody knows about, but also to any information whatsoever that a lawyer gains through or in the course of the representation, whether directly from the client or even from some third person or other source, the disclosure of which would be embarrassing or detrimental to the client, or which the client does not want disclosed, is protected as a secret under Rule 1.6. And that rule applies also. We're going to get to prospective clients a little bit later down the line, but I think it's apt to mention it now. When a prospective client walks into your office, the first thing you should say to them always, or if they call you on the phone, the first thing you should say to them always is, I have not agreed to represent you. You have not agreed to retain me. What we're doing is we're discussing it, and then we'll both make a decision. And that becomes particularly important because very often an attorney-client relationship is formed, even though the lawyer isn't aware of it, because of the reasonable understanding by the client or the prospective client under the circumstances. So when someone comes in, the applicable rule, which we'll get to later, but I'll mention it now, is Rule 1.18, which says that everything that a prospective client tells you is bound by the degree of confidentiality as if it actually was an attorney-client relationship, even if at the end of the day, it never actually matures into an attorney-client relationship. Which means that if you're a lawyer, let's say your bread and butter is Exxon, and someone comes in, a prospective client, and they start talking to you about a case, and it turns out that they are opposite Exxon in some case, and they've disclosed things to you, the technical legal term and ethical term is fried, because you may very well have walked into a conflict without even realizing it. So ethically speaking, when you do your intake, you want to get very little more at the beginning than name, rank, and serial number. That is, what the case involves, who the opposing party is. You don't want them telling you secrets because you don't want to be disqualified. And one of the things that comes out of that is you generally don't want to have the lawyer who's going to be working on the case conducting the intake, because you want to have something like a paralegal or an intake clerk where possible. I understand it's not always possible, but that's the preferred procedure, because that way, if they learn any secrets, they're not going to actually be representing clients. They can be locked away in what used to be called a Chinese wall. Now we call it an ethical screen, not sharing any secrets with any of the other lawyers in the firm. We'll get back to much of this later. Rule 1.7 is the general rule that says that if you are a lawyer in a firm and another lawyer in the firm has a conflict, so do you. Now, that's a great exaggeration because there are ins and outs of the rule, and there are several exceptions. But this is a whole area where you really need to be careful ethically on the intake process. Michael's describing the best processes and the best way to do it. But ethically speaking, it's really wise for the lawyer himself or herself not to be doing the intake. And if you do, making sure you get only basic information so that if a conflict is immediately apparent, you can just hold your hands up and say, stop, don't say another word.
All right, awesome, Saul. Thanks so much. Some really useful information there. And I think that's a perfect segue into talking about how to build your funnel, because all the things he's saying are all factors that contribute towards that plastic casing of how you build the funnel, right? You need to take that in consideration. If you are the type of firm where conflicts arise more regularly, like for instance, you're probably more likely to arise in a conflict if you're talking about like divorce law than you are potentially in other practice areas. You want to make sure that you take those things into consideration. And obviously, as Saul mentioned, and not all of us, especially the ones who are solo practitioners or very small firms, have the benefit of having someone who can wall you off in terms of a receptionist or a paralegal or an intake specialist. But keep those things in mind when building your funnel. So that leads me into the next thing, which is what are some of the factors, right? Ethics is number one. I think that dictates a lot of how you advertise, who you advertise to, how you talk to them, how you manage your intakes. So that's number one. Number two is training your staff. I think it's very important from an ethical consideration to potentially wall yourself off, but understand the cons of that as well, right? If you have someone who you want to make sure is well trained in conversing with the client. I was just actually hanging out at a birthday a few weeks ago, and I have an old high school friend who's a lawyer and he's a PI attorney. And he was asking me like, how do I grow my firm, right? You talk about this all the time. What should I do? And the first question I asked him is like, who's the first person they talk to when they call your firm? And he said, "Oh, it's this, this receptionist." I was like, "Is she a good people person?" He said, "No, she's horrible with people. She's our worst person." I said, "So basically, you're like putting your worst person first." It's like when you walk into Best Buy and they have a greeter that says, "Hey, welcome to Best Buy." Imagine if the first person they walk in is like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Right? You want to have a good impression when you first walk in the door. So you want to make sure that whether it's you're walling yourself off or not, the people that they're talking to is equipped to represent your brand in a positive way and also more likely to sell. A lot of lawyers hate the word sales, but sorry, you have to sell your services no matter how good of a lawyer you are. We all know that person in town who's not a good lawyer, but they have an amazing business. Why? Because they're way better at selling than you or maybe your colleagues might be. So it's really important that when you and your staff are talking to clients, you're well trained and well versed on what are the things they should and should not be saying. The other thing is balancing. I mentioned on this earlier, balancing the matter types in terms of what type of client are they? Are they PI? Are they criminal? Are they estate plan? Are they business? And then also, what type of person are they? Right? I have a lot of times where lawyers will be like, "Yeah, I'm so tech forward. I've got like text messages going out and all these things." And I'm like, "What kind of law are you?" And then it says estate planning. What's the average age of your client? 75. So you're text messaging your 75-year-old client. Are they responding? No, not really. It's so weird. Okay. You really need to take that in consideration, right? Or if they're, if you're working with people like DUIs around colleges and you're working with 20-year-olds, then maybe you should think about, what are some of the things that they're doing that are better ways of communicating than maybe picking up the phone or sending them a fax, right? So those are things you have to consider when you're building it. Another thing is we'll talk about this later, but it's called the Rule of Seven. Harvard Business Journal did a study on sales, and they basically found a link between sales and psychology. And they said it takes humans on average 7 interactions before you learn to trust someone, right? Most people don't trust people the first time they meet them. It takes on average 7 interactions to get to that point of trust. Same thing. So when in terms of selling your services, they always say you want to get to 7 interactions before you ask them to hire you, right? An interaction doesn't have to be a phone call or a meeting. It could be a text message. It could be an email. It could be a visit to a website. It could be a webinar. It could be any of these things. But if you watch 7 of these webinars with me, you're probably going to trust me eventually, whether you should or should not, right? So you kind of build that over time. So make sure whatever you're building your funnel, you have constant touches for the client built into that process. There's also something called conditional logic, which is going to be kind of if this, then that. Right? A lot of people build their process in a very linear function. And if anyone comes off of it, like, "Oh, what if I, can't afford this consultation today, but I can in 2 weeks?" Like, what do you do with that person if you only required paid consultations? What happens if they have, whatever it may be, right? You're doing divorce law, but they maybe have multiple wives or multiple spouses. Some ridiculous examples there. But the point is you want to make sure that you have kind of like the branches of logic built out in your funnel. And then second most important is going to be internal checklists. You guys need to make sure that you have your process figured out internally, and everyone needs to be understanding of that process. Oftentimes, law firms have a lot of turnover, especially at maybe the paralegal or the receptionist level. So do you want to retrain someone from scratch and have to start over every time you have a new staff member? No. If someone's out of the office and sick, and someone has to take over their duties, will they know what to do? You need to build in some sort of internal checklist or process that can be followed. And last but not least is going to be build for you and your clients. A lot of firms do not focus on the client experience. Our CEO of Clio, Jack Newton, wrote an amazing book called The Client-Centered Law Firm. I'd recommend everyone reads it. It's an amazing kind of Bible in terms of like building for the customer. If you think about Uber, Amazon, all of these things are always building around how do you build the customer experience. So you need to do the same. So this is some interesting stats that were found in a study. Law firms who excel at customer service, 37% higher revenue than the average firm, 48% higher profits per attorney, and 33% higher retention. So if anything, build around the customer experience. What do they want to go through? Not what do you want to go through? Remember we talked about front end versus back end? I would always recommend weighing towards front end over back end. Always prioritize the client experience over your employee or firm experience, which often I do not see happen.
You know, Michael, before you go on,
Yep.
It's very interesting. Every year, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel in DC does a survey of the nature of complaints that come in most often. And year after year, largest complaint isn't what people would think, stealing client funds. The biggest complaint is my lawyer doesn't communicate with me.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it is such a small thing like picking up a phone, even if there's no breaking news in the case or in the representation, just picking up a phone and saying, how you doing? Here's what's coming up. I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but I know from ODC that it pays a huge dividends.
Massive amount. And you're 100% right. You beat me to the punch. We were going to talk about the number one law firm complaint is communication. And there are easy ways. If you build your intake process with good tools and you can automate some of that. I had a firm who was a PI attorney, and they were using Lexicata back in the day. And we have something called drip marketing, where basically you can set up an automated sequence of emails. And a lot of people will use it for the sales and intake process to make sure people come back and hire them. This attorney, what they did was they said they used to get, I think he said 15 calls a week from clients because he had hundreds of cases. He said he'd get on average 15 to 30 calls a week from clients angry or inquisitive. What's going on? All he did was build an automated email that went out once every 2 months or something like that, that said, hey, just want to check in, no major updates on your case. I'll be in touch if there is. Something that simple that he literally had automated. I asked him, how many emails have you got, or voicemails or calls have you gotten in the last few months? He said, I get about 1 a week now instead of 15 to 30. So the point is communication is key. So you want to build in those touch points. And here, this is a consumer study. This is Clio. We do a legal trends report every year. So we survey tens of thousands of firms. And we also survey the clients. And for consumers, the number one factor, time and time again, is going to be understanding the process, easy to understand, and timely response. So responsiveness is absolutely huge. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, okay? So here are a couple of tools that you could use in terms of building just the funnel, right? Building the plastic casing. So obviously Clio Grow has amazing tools that you can use that's built specifically for intake. Evernote, you can build like task management systems. Trello is kind of a project management system. Wunderlist, which is now called To-Do, was purchased by Microsoft recently. That's also a to-do list, and Basecamp is another project management software. So you want to find some sort of software, and I would encourage you not just to use your case management software because it's really easy for things to get lost in the shuffle, and it's really hard to build a system that works both for intake and for case management. You want to have kind of bifurcated approach, one versus the other. So now let's jump into the first step of the funnel. So we talked about what are the things to consider when building your funnel: speed, efficiency, communication, ethics, all these things that you want to take into consideration. So the first step, let's talk about initial interaction, right? And we'll talk about exactly what that means, but it's kind of all of the above. Calls, obviously back in the day when we used to do live events, that was a thing. Referrals, website visits, all of these are the initial interaction, right? Like a lot of people tend to think, well, the initial interaction is really the first time I meet with the client. No. All of us have interacted with like a brand typically before we talk to them, okay? So for instance, how clients shop for lawyers. 59% of people seek a referral, 57% of them search on their own. That's been shifting drastically. It used to be a 72% people were referral just 5 years ago. So more people are searching online. Your brand matters. And even if 59% of people seek a referral, and actually if you combine it, 75% seek a referral, or they might search as well. 89% of clients will search online before they decide to hire a lawyer. So even if you come from a referral, they're still Googling you. So it's really important that you set up your brand to reflect yourself. So the initial interaction isn't just the first time you talk to them, it's the first time they interact with you and or your business. So how clients shop for lawyers, we're going to go through this a little bit more detail towards the end. But in terms of the referrals from a friends or family or from lawyer or legal professional, that's the vast majority of where people are coming from. Okay, so you want to make sure that first interaction is really positive. So again, what is considered the initial contact step, right? So like I said, most people think about it's the first time I talk to them. No. It's the first time they interact with your brand. So you want to make sure when you're building your website, I've had this before where I look at a lawyer's website and they've got this beautiful, like modern, really nice. They've got these tall skyscraper buildings like in the background. And then I get on a Zoom with them or I get into their office and they've got paper strewn everywhere. They've got like bookcase set up and they're in this like tiny little shopping center. And I'm like, this isn't at all what I was expecting. I was expecting almost like this big firm, like modern approach, like, you know, automation, all these things. So make sure that you kind of represent yourself well. And it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing to be modern versus not. Like, it's not a bad thing if you're in a shopping center. It's not a bad thing if you're in a big building. Different strokes for different folks. The way I kind of describe it is like online dating. You don't want your online dating profile to have you in a tuxedo looking all fancy and then you show up to your first date in like a tank top and shorts. That doesn't really reflect the type of persona that you're putting off. So you want to make sure you have a consistent brand and your website reflects that, okay? And the other thing is, in terms of, we talked about this, 89% of people look online before they decide to hire. So some of you are thinking, well, most of my people are coming from referrals, so I don't need a good website. You're wrong. Most people are judging you based on your online presence. I've done that multiple times where I've gotten a referral to an attorney for a very specific thing. And then I go and Google them and I look at their website and I judge them before I talk to them. Okay, so first impression lasts forever, as they say. The other thing is in terms of speed. We're going to talk about this consistently for the rest of this conversation, is speed. It is so important that you build really, really, really fast ways to communicate with the client. The average client, 67% of them hire the first person they talk to. So a lot of you might think you're special. Oh, I did such a good job selling them and I'm such a good lawyer and they trust me and trust. Chances are you're just the first person they talk to. Sorry. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean get down on yourself because maybe it's not as important as you thought. The important thing is whatever you do, if there's a client, you stop what you're doing and you call them. Or you have someone like a receptionist or a paralegal or just a sales type of person who can call them, right? Same thing, we'll talk about some of the tools that you can use, but like virtual receptionists are amazing because it doesn't go to voicemail, right? When building your first initial contact step, we talked about this with Saul a minute ago, you wanna build communication the right way. If you look at, and this is from probably 2 years ago, so I think these numbers have shifted drastically since. If you look at people ages 21 to 30, 57% of them prefer web or mobile communication. When you get into your 70s, only 40% prefer web or mobile. So again, when you're building your process, you want to think about who your clients are and what they prefer. And then this is an interesting part from the Legal Trends report. So how quickly do potential clients expect firms to respond when they leave a phone message, or an email? 79% of consumers expect a response within 24 hours, which is normal, right? Most of us, if we call and leave a voice message, we expect within that day or the next day, someone will get back to us. Less than, if you look at this blue, right? This is the percentage of firms that are actually responding. So it's like less than half are responding very quickly, okay? So you wanna make sure your delivery matches the expectations, right? Client experience is the number one thing that you should be focusing on. So the question is, so I always do these and then I get questions, or I get a lot of, especially when I'm doing these presentations, I get a whole lot of long faces, right? I get a whole lot of, oh crap, I'm not doing this, like I'm dropping the ball. So the good news is we are playing in, junior varsity land when it comes to law firms and how they run their business. It's kind of sad, honestly. So there was, Legal Trends report, again, Clio does this every year. We have amazing stats on it, but also ABA actually did something called, they did a client intake study a few years ago. All right. So 57% didn't return a phone call within 3 days. Let me repeat that to you. 39% of calls went to voicemail. So if I called a firm, there was a 40% chance almost that they didn't pick up, which is horrible. And then even worse, 57% of people did not call back within a 3-day period of time. So my point is this: all you have to do is not suck as much as your colleagues do, and you will be, and that's your pathway to an amazing growth and amazing opportunities at success. You're not battling against Google and Amazon, which you can call and contact someone within 30 seconds, right? You're talking about law firms who are literally not even calling people back, right? So again, they take forever to respond. And then I'll also talk about empathy. So this was part of that ABA study. So if there's two things you take away from this whole presentation, I guarantee you your law firm will grow if you just do two things: call people back faster and or just pick up the darn phone. And two is have empathy, okay? So obviously this isn't as important when you're talking about like a business or, estate planning, but like if you're a divorce lawyer or a DUI lawyer, you have no idea how many times, look, 42% of people who called a law firm said that law firm had zero, not even a little, zero empathy for their problem, okay? I just got pulled over. I just spent the night in jail. My life is falling apart. I'm going to get my license revoked. I'm going to lose my job. Okay, cool. Here's the retainer, and go ahead and fill out this intake sheet, and then we'll schedule a time to come in. Bye. Zero empathy. How about, man, I can understand how hard this situation must be for you. Don't worry, we're here for you. We're going to work through this together, right? Literally, you will be in the top 20% of law firms if you just somewhat empathize with them. That's how bad it is, okay? So two things you take away from this: have a little bit of empathy at minimum and respond quickly, all right? So what are some lessons from the initial contact stage of the funnel? First of all, always answer immediately. You want to make sure that you have a way of communicating. And when you do communicate, maybe just ask them, how do you prefer we communicate with you? Do you want email, text message, or phone call? We'll do whatever you want, right? Like it's, have it your way, right? So you want to make sure that you kind of understand what they're looking for. Customer service is so important. Most firms, or like Saul was saying, the number one complaint is not that you lost their case. It's not that you're not a good lawyer. It's that you just don't talk to them. They just feel neglected. They're in an abusive relationship with their lawyer, and you don't show them enough love. All you got to do is show them a little bit of love, even if it's automated, and you will be light years ahead of your competition. Start the touches early and often. And if you have a system like a Clio Grow or like some of the ones that I showed you earlier, and I'll show you a couple more on the next slide, build in some automated sequences, okay? Build in some ways that you can automatically follow up with them so you don't put so much onus on yourself to do it, okay? Track and follow up with them, right? The number one reason why people always called me was their leads were falling between the cracks. So there are two ways you can do that. Categorize them and put them in buckets so you know who to follow up with it, and stop using your case management software to track your leads. A CRM, which is a customer relationship management system, doesn't matter what you use, whether it's legal focused or whether it's not, use something that's built for sales and intake process. Don't use your case management system unless it has a very, very, very robust intake system, which pretty much none of them do. Some of them will have some very basic features, but you want a system specifically built for intake. So I'm going to pass it to Saul really quickly. He's going to touch on some ethics issues before I talk about some tools you can use to improve communications.
All right. So again, all these things are very broad topics, and it's really important that you, A, read the rules, and B, if any questions arise, you can always call us at the Legal Ethics Helpline. Let's just spend a couple minutes talking about advertising in general. So DC and this is an area where we are markedly different than the ABA and model rules. They have all kinds of requirements, like, and you have to have a lawyer's name and phone number associated with every ad, and it has to say advertising material. We don't have anything like that. We are sort of a hybrid. We think that advertising is wonderful. Everybody wins. Lawyers get to ply their wares. They get to let the public and prospective clients know what services they're offering. Clients get to, know what lawyers are out there doing what. But essentially, if you look at Rule 7.1, all of advertising, regardless of what media you're doing it on, whether it's on the internet or print media or whatever that is, or person-to-person contact, falls into three categories. Number one, what you say has to be true. That's obvious. Number two, it has to be empirically verifiable. For example, there are certain lawyers where if they said they were one of the top 50 civil rights practitioners in DC, and you polled 100 lawyers, probably 100 out of 100 would say top 50, he's probably top 3, but it's still not an empirically verifiable fact. And 3, this is where the rubber really hits the road. We are extremely tight on misrepresentation, where the standard is that it can't be potentially misleading to a reasonable person, an incredibly high standard. Just one example, we often get the question, can a non-DC lawyer maintain a DC law firm? And the answer is they can. The problem is a reasonable person seeing that lawyer associated with a DC law firm, letterhead, business card, website, whatever, might naturally assume that they're admitted to practice law in DC. And if they're not, that would be misleading. So if you're going to list their names on their letterhead, on their business cards, on the website, it would have to say something along the lines of admitted in Florida only, or not admitted to the practice of law in DC, making it very, very clear that they're not a DC lawyer. Again, that's just an example. So generally speaking, advertising, you have to be very careful not to mislead. And also before, I just wanted to add before we move on, I didn't really get to the heart of 1.7 on doing an accurate, excellent conflicts check on intake. Before you sign up a client, you have to be careful not only about Rule 1.7, which involves primarily conflicts with existing clients, but also Rule 1.9, which is extremely important, dealing with conflicts with previous clients, including the everlasting duty, and yes, it is forever, to maintain the confidences and secrets of a former client. So, for example, let's say if you undertake the representation of somebody who intake process comes into your office, you would need to use information that you gained through or in the course of a former representation. That's classic rock and hard place, because on one hand, you would have the duty to the new client to use that information and disclose it, and you would have a duty to the former client not to. So we do have a really special program at the DC Bar. You can call me for information. It basically, especially for solo practitioners, small firms, where the head of that department, his name is Dan Mills. I don't have the number with me right now, unfortunately. You can either call the bar number and ask for Dan or call me. Will actually help you set up your firm, help you with intake procedures, help you with conflicts checks and computer systems and the whole 9 yards of that nature. And it is entirely free. If you are a member of DC Bar, we like to call it your membership dues at work.
Awesome. Thank you, Saul, so much. Very informative as usual. So let's talk about, before we move on to the next step of the funnel, let's talk about a couple of tools you can use to improve relationships. First of all, there are tons of these, but Ruby Receptionist or Virtual Receptionist Service, Answer One, Lex Reception, the Ruby Receptionist, there's tons of them. Great way to improve your relationship is by having someone always there to answer the phone, even if they don't work for your firm. It's a relatively affordable way to not have to hire a full-time receptionist. Same thing with like live chat on your website, for instance. There's like Engage Live Chat. There's tons of different versions of that. So you might want to consider putting a live chat feature, and they basically will increase your retention rate. MailChimp, we talked about some automated campaigns. You can do tons of those things with MailChimp. Keep them on your newsletter. Maybe have a different newsletter for your current clients than you do from your previous clients, so you can communicate to all of them. Clio Grow, we talked about having a lot of amazing like automation sequences and ways to keep track of your leads in there. Rapportive, which gets worse and worse every year. Unfortunately, it was bought by LinkedIn. And like most things that Microsoft or big company buys, they kind of just go to die eventually. But what they do is they help pull your social media profile. So if you're emailing someone, it'll pull out on the right sidebar. It'll show you their LinkedIn and stuff so you can connect with them. So remember I told you about building those 7 touches, those interactions. Adding them on social media is a great way to do that. And then again, Constant Contact and MailChimp are kind of similar. So there's a few great tools that will help you with that. So as we're getting deeper in the funnel, we're kind of getting deeper and deeper into the relationship, and we're getting deeper into the process. So this is my least and most favorite part of the intake, which is the information collection phase. This is when you're going to be doing your consultations, as Saul was talking about, doing your your 1.7 conflict checks. You're doing your documents like engagement letters, intake forms, things like that. So this is the information collection phase. So a couple of things that I think a lot of firms don't do a good job of asking themselves, which is these questions that we learned when we were in first grade. Who, what, where, when, why, how, right? A lot of firms will just be doing stuff because they've just been doing it like that for 20 years. And they won't often ask that question. Like, who is doing the collection? Like I told you, my buddy who's having his paralegal who's not a good people person doing the intake, probably not a great idea if they're not a nice person. What are you collecting? How are you collecting it, right? Are you taking it down over the phone and writing it down? Are you doing a piece of paper? Are you having them fill out an intake form online? Are you having them download and print a PDF? Are you doing a Word document? You really want to optimize that process. So I would get away from paper intake forms, especially during the pandemic. It's not even possible. I would get away from PDFs that you have to print and scan. And I would get away from Word docs that look really ugly. Use online forms. I'll talk about some places that you can use online forms, but you want to automate these things. You already have remember we talked about operational efficiency. You're already having the client fill out their information. Why are you going to duplicate their information and duplicate the data entry? You might as well just have them do the data entry for you, and I'll show you different ways that you can do that. There's also what I call the 1 to 100 rule. And this is, I think, a problem that a lot of law firms have because they don't focus on client experience. You have 100 clients, maybe more, maybe less, but let's call it 100 clients. How many lawyers does the client have? They've got one for that one problem, right? So what I always say is you need to treat it like 1 to 100. They're not one of 100, they're one of one. But the problem is that you make them feel like 1 out of 100, which is why Saul mentioned the number 1 complaint is communication, because you don't make them feel loved. You don't make them feel appreciated, and you don't necessarily, make their life easy. So find that balance, right? And then in terms of, so my first job when I was in law school, I worked for the Department of Justice in the bankruptcy side of things at the U.S. trustee. And I remember the first time I saw an intake form, it was 47-page PDF that this bankruptcy lawyer was asking their client to fill out. Why in Sam hell are you asking them to fill out a 47-page form? Do you need all that information to retain them? Probably not. Do you want all that information? Probably not. If you were on the other side of it, would you sign up with your lawyer? Probably not. If you walked into Apple and said, I want to buy a computer, and they said, okay, great, I need to make sure we're getting the right computer for you. Here's a 25-page document. Go fill this out, and then we'll sell you a computer. You'd be like, what the heck are you talking about? No, I'm not doing that. I'm not spending 5 hours. Same thing they experience. They get that. I had the first salesperson I hired at my first company. I asked them if they had any experience with lawyers. And they said, yeah, I think we hired an estate planning lawyer for my mom. I was like, okay, walk me through that process. And she said, well, we met with them, and then they sent me this form to fill out. And then she paused, and I was like, then what? She's like, oh my God. We never got her estate plan set up. I never filled out that form. I completely forgot. She literally, because she was like, oh, I got a bunch of work I got to do, she put it to the side and then never came back to it and completely forgot about it. Find the balance between pain and necessity. And most importantly, think like a startup. Think about how Uber makes it so easy to get in to order a car, get in and get out and pay through the app. make your process of information collection, the consultation, everything as smooth as humanly possible. So here's some tools to use for improving those the collection phase. Zoom is obviously an amazing way to do during the pandemic. It's also a great way to not force people to come to the office, even when you go back to the office. A lot of people are like, I don't want to drive across the city. Well, now you expanded your audience. Instead of just being in that one part of downtown that people are willing to drive to, now you can have, clients in the burbs. Calendly is a great way to schedule meetings where you can allow them to book directly through your calendar. Through Clio Grow, we've got amazing tools with where it'll automate your data entry. So they fill out an intake form, it auto-populates your case management system. Google Forms has similar stuff. It just won't integrate as nicely, but still some amazing free forms on there. And then Dropbox is a great way where they can upload documents and get them stored to you. So now that we've been through the 2 steps of the funnel, let's finish up with the retention phase, right? And this is arguably the most important part of your funnel, right? So this is where you're going to be collecting your payment for technically, well, obviously you might have already formed an attorney-client relationship during the consultation without realizing it. But this is where you're formally creating engagement letters and things like that. So let's talk about this, right? Remember we talked about the rule of 7, take 7 interactions. By the time you get them to ask them to sign an engagement letter or pay you, you probably should be sure you've had those 7 interactions with them, because you want that trust. And the number one reason why someone does or does not hire a lawyer, you guessed it, trust. So you want to have that trust built. Eliminate barriers, make it as easy on them as possible. Like I said, don't have a 47-page form. Maybe have a 10-page form now and then ask them for the other 30 pages over the next couple months after you've retained them. Close like a salesperson. A lot of people are scared to do this. Obviously, you don't want to have misleading or any kind of solicitation issues, but that doesn't mean you can't sell yourself. Here's why I'm the best lawyer. Here's why I'm going to do good for you. Here's why you should hire me. Take a darn credit card. I think something like 45% of law firms are still taking most of their payment through check. It's 2020, guys. You can't even take a check because it's technically the CDC won't even tell you to do that. Take a credit card. You get paid way faster. I think the average bill gets paid 32% faster through credit cards. It's worth the fee. Eat the fee. Don't worry about it.
Michael, gotta interrupt here. Again, without going into detail, because it's a complex area, there are significant ethics issues involving accepting payment or advances by credit cards. Significant ethics issues, including one that could result in, really the nuclear damage from the bar. I'm not saying by any means, I'm not suggesting that taking a credit card is proscribed, but there are lots of I's to dot, T's to cross, even if you're accepting the fee yourself and paying it yourself, involving trust accounts, operating accounts. Again, I'm only touching on the edges of it. So when you say take a credit card, that may be a good process in terms of our subject here today, but you really do need to be aware of the fact that there are significant ethics ramifications in using a credit card or PayPal or anything else, not the least of which is Rule 1.6. Remember that all-important duty to maintain client confidences and secrets, whether or not you have control, whether or not there's a dispute, all kinds of issues. So be careful, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Of course, and that's why it's so important, and I'll show you in the next slide, to pick a payment processor that's authorized and promoted by the ABA, like Clio Payments or LawPay, and make sure you have your separate IOLTA accounts and your operating accounts set up to make sure that you're, like you said, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And then last but not least is make sure you have a process for what happens after they're retained. I've literally sent someone a check for $3,000 and then I didn't hear from them for a month in terms of their retainer. And I'm like, what the heck is supposed to be happening? Automatically lose confidence in that firm to be able to provide good services. So create some automated follow-ups using whatever intake system you're using to create a better client experience. And here are a couple of tools that you can use. HelloSign is a great, and DocuSign are great tools for doing e-signature. We have that built into Clio Grow. We talked about Clio Payments versus LawPay and different. Make sure you're using one that's kind of approved by the ABA. And then you also want to be getting reviews. We'll talk about this in a second as we're wrapping up. Bird Eye is a great way, and they integrate with Clio, where you can basically get reviews from your clients. So we'll talk about that in just a second. I know I was at the ethics stuff you want to talk about, Saul?
Just
David?
very quickly filling in a couple of holes, and then maybe depending on what you do to finish up. First is when you talk about referrals, it's very important to remember that a lawyer may not accept or pay a referral fee. That is absolutely an ethics violation under Rule 7.1. And I suspect it is under the ABA rules as well.
It is.
You're allowed to, for example, if you have a civil rights practice and somebody comes in with a tort case, you refer that tort case to the tort guy and he refers civil rights cases to you. But it can't be a quid pro quo, because in every instance, you have to make an independent assessment about whether it's really in the client's interest or the prospective client's interest to refer to this particular lawyer. For example, money may be an issue for the client, tough finances, and this lawyer you want to refer her to is excellent, but charges $700 an hour. These are things, you have to talk about. We also already talked about prospective clients and how important it is to remember to keep confidential secrets. And with that, Michael, please go on.
All right, thank you so much. And then now that we're getting towards the end, the CLE code is MB, like Mercedes-Benz 37. So we're going to mention that a couple more times. So now we get to the last part, and we're going to quickly run through this. This is the analyzation section. And I think a lot of people look at the funnel and then just give up after the funnel, right? If they look at it at all. We need to make sure that we analyze things, right? Know your pipeline, know your system inside and out. Where are the issues occurring? Your funnel should be flexible, right? Like with this pipe where you've got this, where you've got this clog. If you have one of those plastic PVC pipes, well, it's a lot easier to dislodge those things. So make sure you have a flexible funnel that's not just dictated in terms of like one type of case. You might have different funnels for different type of cases. You also want to know how to diagnose issues. So make sure you're talking with your staff and figuring that stuff out. So where does the time go? Most people are spending doing business development. Look how little people are spending doing technology and kind of improving their process. So you just allocate some of your business development towards technology and office administration, and you'll see more, more results from your business development. 71% of firms rank their revenue growth as their most important law firm indicator of growth. So let's talk about a couple of these metrics to keep in mind, and then we're wrapping up. First is going to be called CAC, which is client acquisition costs. How much does it cost you to acquire a client? How much do your salespeople cost you? How much do your profit sharing with your lawyers cost you? And how much do your advertising cost you? And divide that number divided by the number of clients, and that's going to be how much each client costs you to acquire. What is a lifetime value? Like, for instance, if you're a DUI lawyer, do you get them for 2 or 3 DUIs? Is it not just you have to basically measure that. And what you do is you want to look at what is your value of a client versus how much does it cost you? And you want to be at a very good ratio. That's kind of also like your profit margins to some extent. ROI is your return on investment. How much are you spending versus how much are you receiving back? Net promoter score, which is going to be how likely they are to refer you to someone else. And then to time and pipeline and average touches. Again, going back, 91% of people can't calculate their ROI, and most people just have really bad tracking. So you want to make sure you have a system that allows you to track for data. Even if you're using a spreadsheet, that's better than nothing. And you want to track like where your leads are coming from, how many of them are coming in, what type of practice there are, and so on and so forth. So a bunch of tools, again, to help you analyze these things. Again, the CLE code is MB37. And you want to, and you can use Clio Grow as some amazing metrics, Google Analytics for tracking your website, MailChimp for tracking your open rates on your mail campaigns. Clio Payments will help you track like your realization, or Clio plus Clio Payments will allow you to track realization versus billing. So you can see how many do you bill versus actually collect. And then again, last thing is, just because you've got the funnel doesn't mean you don't have to think outside of it. When you're managing a referral, how are you managing them? Are you communicating them with monthly emails? Are you keeping in touch with them? Are you doing whatever? Obviously, you got to make sure, again, you don't want to compensate people depending on what state you're in. And obviously with DC, you can't do any like, quid pro quo, as we said. But keep in mind that your previous clients are your cheapest form of marketing. So you want to make sure you're keeping in touch with those people. And then, Saul, was there any last ethics that we haven't covered so far?
Please grab a pen and paper to write down the CLE code. The CLE code for today's class is M as in Mary, B as in Brown, 37. I'm going to repeat that 2 more times. It is M as in Mary, B as in Brown, 37, M as in Mary, B as in Brown, 37. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually just want to close with 2 phone numbers. Again, a reminder of mine, 202-780-2768. And I talked about Dan Mills before and this extraordinary program we have here to help people, lawyers, DC lawyers with anything having to do with running their practice. His number is 202-780-2762. Again, 780-2762. Thank you.
All right, awesome. So there are a couple of rules for sake of time. We're not going to put all these up here, but there's in the slides, there's some great rules that are good to reference. And
yeah,
then again,
DC doesn't even have a 7.2 and 7.3, just as an example. I mean, but we already talked about 7.1.
Yeah. So again, think about all of these things when you're talking about ease of the likelihood to recommend. Cost isn't even number one. 12 or is barely number one. Bedside manner and personality, responsiveness, and ease of understanding of case expectations. That's really what most people want when they're working with their case. They don't care as much about the result, even though they obviously do. They don't know the difference between a good lawyer and a bad lawyer. They just know the difference between a caring lawyer and a lawyer who doesn't care.
And I would just add rule 1.4, to wit, thou shalt communicate with thy client. It is an ethical imperative, not just a good idea.
Correct. And so last thing I'll mention, then we're done, is what do you do with your funnel? A lot of people leave my presentation, they'll go, oh, I got some awesome ideas from this, I'm going to go back. And then they'll implement those ideas and then they'll never touch it again for another 20 years. That shouldn't be your process. You guys should have maybe quarterly or monthly sit downs with your team, evaluate, define what you're doing, train your staff, look at the results with data, and then iterate and improve on the process and start it all over again. This is a constantly evolving thing. What do the old companies do, like GM and some of these old companies that are starting to kind of die away? They're not improving. They're not getting better. So you don't want to go the way of the dodo bird. So you want to make sure that your firm is keeping up with the newest tracking. So again, most firms are not tracking feedback from your clients. So there's 2 ways you improve your process. You talk to your staff, you talk to your clients. Don't be afraid to ask them for advice. 37% of firms do not ask for feedback, and 42% of them barely kind of do. Only 10% are doing surveys, and 5% are doing actual like collection of how they did. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. If anything, that actually helps your reviews, because the people who leave bad reviews are the ones who feel like they weren't attended to or they didn't get the right result. Sometimes a call can impact one of those negative reviews. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this awesome quote that I remember. This guy, he was the head of Gmail. He was on an NPR segment a few years ago, and he had this quote that was really inspired me. And he said, don't look at how technology can help you do what you're already doing just better. Look at how it can open your eyes to things that you never thought were possible. So don't just take this and say, hey, we could take our paper intake forms and put them online. That's great. But think about different ways that you can use those intake forms in ways that you haven't really thought about before. So again, CLE code is MB37. That's it. Saul and I, the greatest duo of all time. Thanks so much, Saul, for helping us out and keeping us in line with your ethics. Unlike you, I'm not as bold to leave my phone number, so do not call me, but you are welcome to email me. You're welcome to @ me or tweet me. You can also tweet Cleo, and you can always find me on LinkedIn if you want to connect there. Thanks so much, guys. It's been a pleasure. Good luck. And remember, client comes first.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you. Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying this virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, Equal Pay and Workplace Hiring and Retention Practices, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct codes to receive credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also, in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, feel free to send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we will be happy to assist you. If you're watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions you have for faculty in the chat room and our presenters will be available to answer any questions that you have. Now, without any further delay, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Dennis, for those announcements. I'm Julian Bermesco, Employment Counsel with the Office of General Counsel of the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm pleased today to have such an illustrious panel discussing equal pay and workplace hiring and retention practices. Today we have Robin Runge, who is a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School, where she teaches public interest lawyering and domestic violence law, including the clinical education program. She's also the co-director of the Equality and Inclusion Department at the Solidarity Center. We also have Susan Huta, a partner at Outten and Golden, where she runs the DC Individual Practice Group and is the managing partner of the DC office. Before that, for over 10 years, she was at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, where she ran the Equal Employment Opportunity Project. So we have very, very knowledgeable faculty today. I'm sure you're going to teach us a lot about equal pay and workplace hiring and retention practices. So thank you to the faculty. And let's get started by my asking, how do we even define pay equity and pay equality?
I'll start. So pay equity in law certainly is generally defined as equal pay for equal work. And the definition of equal work is basically situations where men and women are performing the same work. That's how, for example, the Equal Pay Act deals with the concept of pay equity and mandates pay equity. And it's a traditional legal framework, and it's, as we'll discuss later on today, it's quite limited in that regard.
Robin, I remember when I was in college walking around with an ERA button on my backpack, there was a lot of talk about comparable worth. What's that? How does that differ from equal pay?
And it's a great question. And actually, comparable worth is a preferable, not just term, but approach, right? Because what comparable worth recognizes is that we can do comparisons between different jobs and even different industries, right? It recognizes things like, for example, care work has the same value, I would argue, to construction work. And yet the pay for those positions is very different. And if we stick with our limited assessment, as Sue described it, of pay equity or equal pay for equal work, we wouldn't be able to compare, right? We wouldn't be able to engage in a process of valuing those different jobs. And that's what comparable worth really gets at. And that kind of analysis would allow us to, I think, be more effective in addressing the pay gap, because it would allow us to really challenge situations legally, and we're going to hear from Sue more about this, where traditional female jobs are underpaid relative to traditional male jobs.
That leads me to the next question, which would be, we all hear that. We all hear that women earn 80 cents for every male dollar. But what does that actually mean? And then what's the current state of affairs? What's the data telling us about now?
Yeah. So unfortunately, we've been stagnant for a long time. There was progress for many, many years in closing the pay gap. And sadly, for most of my adult life, we've been stagnant where we recognize that in the United States, women really only earn about 80 cents to the what we call the male dollar. And what that means is we're comparing women to men, and when men make $1, women make 80 cents. I would say that what has progressed in that time frame, I think, in our efforts to try to advocate more effectively for addressing the pay gap, is recognizing that all women are not the same and all men are not the same. And so now we have even more detailed calculus that helps us understand that, for example, African American women make 62 cents compared to a white man's $1. Right? Or Hispanic women make 54 cents. I mean, this is insane when I say these things out loud, right? To the white man's dollar. And Asian women make 89 cents. And then we have to also account for geography, right? That there's a wide difference in terms of what the pay gap looks like in, say, Utah, where it's 70 cents. And here in DC, it's much closer, right? And so I think what I want to recognize is that as we have become more sophisticated with our intersectional analysis, we've also seen, and we'll talk about this, different organizations really help us focus by having multiple equal pay days through the year that really highlight, like, how many more months, right, does a woman have to, months, literally, does a woman have to work to make annually the same as a white man? And as you can see from the different percentages here and the amounts of money, depending upon both your race and your gender, that can be, we just celebrated, I shouldn't say celebrated, noted Native American Equal Pay Day just last week, right? That gives you a sense that a Native American woman has to work, 9 more months, right, to make as much as a white man. So it's really, I have to say, we're not in a good place on the pay gap.
That's exactly right. And you can slice and dice the data in other ways as well. So, for example, one of the biggest indicators is what's referred to in the literature as the motherhood penalty, right? So employed mothers actually account for the majority of that wage gap. So if you're only looking at mothers in the workforce, when we're talking about 80 cents, women earn 80 cents to a male's dollars overall, that number drops to 71 cents if you're talking about mothers. Likewise, it's not static over the course of a worker's life. So when you get into your 50s, for men, that is often the time in their life when they're making the most money. For women, that's not true. So the gap becomes highest between men and women between the ages of 55 to 64. And we can look at that as directly related to the glass ceiling, right? People rising up and it's a sweet spot of earning for a lot of workers. And you have to think about it. It goes well beyond workers. It goes into retirement. It impacts how much Social Security you're going to get. For some people, it impacts, particularly in this jurisdiction where a lot of people are government employees and they actually have pensions. It impacts your pension and your income well into retirement. When we're talking about this 80 cents on the dollar and the incremental changes that have been happening over the past 10 years, we have to think about COVID, because COVID is, in our lifetime, let's hope this is the only pandemic we have. Interestingly enough, recessions tend to narrow the wage gap. Men tend to be disproportionately affected in recessions, harder hit than women. This pandemic has been the reverse. So women have been much worse impacted than men. That's for a couple of reasons that may be obvious to you, but women are in sectors of the economy or dominant in sectors which have been the hardest hit. So that's, restaurants, hospitality, travel. So the women unemployment rate is higher than men's right now. And then secondarily, as we all know, this recession has been unique in that people have a problem with childcare that doesn't normally exist. So, your kids are home from school, you've lost your daycare, and because of the social distancing obligations, when you might be able to have grandma come over and provide some childcare, we don't have that anymore. So that's a second reason. So COVID has actually, we're making tiny incremental gains in women's full employment and then towards pay equity. And this has set us back, and that's going to continue. The ripple effects of that are going to continue long after COVID is behind us.
So, interesting point. How does the U.S. stack up against internationally? How do our pay equity issues compare with other developed and non-developed countries?
Well, so it's dangerous to go global because I'm going to make some generalizations here, but I think it's a good question. And the International Labor Organization just recently, in 2018, issued their most recent report looking at the pay gap, and they collected data from a wide spectrum of countries. And what they found is that globally, they say it's about 16%, the pay gap between men and women. So, we would say we're, a little worse, right? It's incredible to say that. I think America is increasingly learning, that where we kind of situate ourselves is different than where we may think. And then just to give you kind of an idea of the spectrum there, and this is actually really interesting because I think this is something that I know I didn't think a lot about before I started doing international work. I thought, okay, well, there must be countries that have a wider pay gap, and absolutely there is. And we know, for example, that Pakistan, right, has a much lower or wider pay gap between women and men, 34%. But then there's also countries where women make more than men. And so in the Philippines, women are making 10.3% more than men. So I think that gives you an idea of kind of what the possibilities are. And I really think it's important, as I think about the pay gap and pay equity work, to think about and see and understand globally how the International Labor Organization and how other countries are attempting to address the pay gap, and what their analysis is and what they've tried that has been effective. And we're going to talk more about that later.
Okay. Thank you. So, what are the key factors that lead to this gender inequality? How does this happen in the first place?
I'm happy to start. Or Sue, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. One of the biggest one we've mentioned before is what they call the motherhood penalty. So women are providing unpaid care work. This can cause them to leave the workforce for periods of time. There's an absolute penalty based on each child a woman has that's measurable, statistical. It's about $16,000 per child. Career breaks, this can cause people to have to go part-time, limit their flexibility in their hours. So that's one of the biggest ones. And then, following up on that is just basic discrimination, right? We can't forget that. We can't forget there's the maternal, what Joan Williams refers to as the maternal wall, glass ceiling issues, basic gender stereotyping about, women working for, I have a case right now in litigation where the men in the office referred to women working for their jewelry versus men working for their households. So those are two obvious ones, but there are a number of factors. Robin, you want to talk about some?
Yeah, I would say in my work with low-wage workers globally, what I see is occupational segregation. It's really profound, right? And this is based on gender stereotypes traditionally, but in the United States, this is really the case. I worked for Wider Opportunities for Women for a while, and one of the things we really kept track of there and did annual data research was on occupational segregation and would issue annually kind of what the updates were. And I was always shocked, right, that we have such incredible occupational segregation. And so you mentioned some examples. So here's some more: nurses, teachers. If I basically name every low-paying job that is precarious and lacks protections, you're going to see it's predominantly occupied by women and people of color. I mean, that's just kind of the way it is domestically. And I have to say, again, in my work globally, that's the case. And so we know that occupational segregation goes back to that conversation we were having at the very beginning about comparable worth, right? I mean, there is a direct correlation here. And so we're seeing the application of gender stereotypes into the workplace. Care work is another place. Any kind of care work is not appropriately, right, paid for. And these are all women's jobs, right? So I'm going to put this in quotes because it's, things are evolving. I believe that. I work toward it every day. This is what Sue and I do for a living, but we're not there yet, right? These are still perceived to be women's jobs. And as a result, they systemically are paid less. And I want to just say pay is not just wages, right? Pay is benefits, right? Access to all the different things that Sue talked about earlier. And so here's an interesting thing, though. I followed some research for a while, and there's been this philosophy about, well, wait a minute, what if we bring more men, right, into women's work? Will that increase? It's an interesting question, right? Let's change.
People thought that as more men went into nursing,
exactly,
that would raise the salaries.
Exactly, Jillian. And in fact, it did not. And that's, so that's a really profound moment, right? Just to, I don't think we fully unpacked the meaning of that. I would say the other thing is construction is a really good place where, and in the trades generally, our sisters have been fighting for decades to increase the percentage of people in those positions that are women because the opportunities are so wonderful. Those are wonderful jobs. They're great opportunities. I've talked to women who do those jobs. They love them. And you can raise a family on those wages. And yet we're finding that even where we are achieving, and again, the numbers aren't profound yet, 5% or 6%. I mean, nationwide, those numbers are still paltry. But when we get to 5% or maybe 20% on a particular job site, we still are, what we see there is the wages still stay high. Right. So it's an interesting thing to think about is how, if we know occupational segregation is one of our challenges, how do we address that? Right. Like this is one of the ongoing conundrums is even when we see more integration in particular sectors, we don't actually see increases in wages for the people in what are perceived to be women's work. So those are some other key factors. I'll turn it back to you, Sue, for some more.
And how does can you explain a lack of transparency? Like how does that work, and how does that create or perpetuate the gender pay gap?
Yeah, we see it all the time. You go for an interview for a job. Very often, there's not even a salary range that's posted. You have no idea what the position's going to pay, and the employer has a lot of discretion to pay people doing whether they're identical jobs or whether they're similar but different. But across a corporation, they have discretion to pay women lower than men doing identical or similar jobs. And, this is what we learned from Lily Ledbetter. She can go on for decades in that position with her male peers working right along beside her, having no idea that when she was hired, they paid her several dollars less. And then each year, everybody got a 3% increase and that sort of thing. And so that disparity widened over time. This is, and then, there are employers that have limited employees' discretion and ability to share information with each other. So even after you're hired, trying to figure that out can be difficult. And some people even put their job in jeopardy by doing so. And there's this discussion that happens. It's sort of the lean in discussion. Do women have control, and is it simply getting women to lean in and be the harder negotiators?
Right. Can we negotiate better for ourselves? Is that, does that figure into it?
Exactly. And there are gender normative rules about how aggressive you can and should be, and women certainly internalize some of those. But I challenge the lean-in model as a full explanation for how negotiations go, because I also think the employer can, respect a hard-charging male who's got his demands and will meet them and will welcome that healthy discussion, whereas that can be very off-putting to a lot of employers when women actually do lean in and try to aggressively negotiate their pay. So it's not just the women who aren't aggressively negotiating. It's the employers that can be very put off by that. They can let women go and say, well, nope, you counter offered. We're not going to meet your demand, and they go somewhere else. Whereas if a man had made that counter offer, it very well might have worked.
Well, this is all very depressing in light of the fact that we have an equal pay law. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about why it isn't enough. Why hasn't this federal law that's been on the books for quite a long time now, why hasn't this eliminated the problem?
Yeah, so I'll start on this one. I'm going to start by trying to say something positive. Equal Pay Act was enacted in 1963. At that point in time, we weren't talking about 80 cents on the dollar. We were talking something about 60 cents on the dollar. And it was an era in which a lot of companies had different pay scales for men and women doing the exact same job that was legal, and it was common, and it had, it led to that even wider gulf.
I'm old enough to remember when there were male and female want ads.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in large measure, the Equal Pay Act went straight at those sorts of practices and rendered them obviously illegal. And if there was a man and a woman on an assembly line, this eliminated those pay gaps in large measure. The pay disparities that exist today, as Robin pointed out, there's segregated workforces, and different professions are paid differently and valued differently. But the pay disparity that exists among and between men and women who are performing identical or similar jobs is much more subtle. It's not like when she interviews, they say, oh, you're a woman, so you only get X, whereas, the men doing your job get Y. And I'll go far, I'll sort of catch us up now to where we are now. Now you have this 1963 law that says you have to pay women equal pay for equal work. And the courts have construed this, that's fairly consistent with the legislative history and what was intended, is to say that the woman has to find a male doing something near to her identical work and being paid more before she even has a cause of action. So, and it's, I'm trying to give a good example so you understand just how rigid this is. Two salespeople who have slightly different sales territories. One has 5 states, one has 7 states. In general, the courts will find those subtle differences and say, that man might be paid more than you, and you might have more experience in this and that. You might even have higher sales performance than that guy, but he's not a valid comparator because there are slight differences between what you do. And you have to have a male comparator. Someone's doing the same work in a substantially near identical job for you to even get, off to first base in an Equal Pay Act claim. And you go from there to, let's say you do have a comparator who does do a job very close to yours. The Equal Pay Act has several affirmative defenses, and they, until recently, have included all sorts of things that allow an employer to say, well, he had more training opportunities. That those training opportunities may have been influenced by gender to negatively influence her. That's a valid defense under the EPA. For a long time, I'm foreshadowing what we're going to talk about next, but for a long time, prior pay was a valid defense for an employer of why they paid people differently. So in her prior job, she was only making $8. Him in his prior job, he was making $12. So that's why we paid him $13 and we paid her $9.
And we've all seen that.
Say again?
We've all seen that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in the way the discrimination in pay is operating largely today, the Equal Pay Act really doesn't get at it and doesn't provide an obvious path to a remedy.
How about the Lilly Ledbetter Act that had so much publicity a little while ago? I mean, has that helped at all?
Lilly Ledbetter absolutely helped. So her story is very long time ago, with obvious gender discrimination when she was hired. And then, it was 20 years later, and it would not have been very obvious for her to identify a discriminatory decision maker. They're all getting 3% raises every year, and she's getting the 3% raises just like everybody else. And the Ledbetter case said she can look to the bias in the historical pay decisions to prove her pay disparity case in the present. So that was a hugely helpful thing. But again, she was comparing herself to men who largely did almost exactly what she did.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Now, there have been improvements, though, right? I mean, we are moving in a good direction. I know both of you are working very hard to be moving us in that direction. So, so take us and tell us what's positive. What can we look forward to now, and what's the status now?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just mention this one federal case, and then I'll let Robin talk about what's been going on at the state and local level. But this Rizzo v. Ovino case, it's a Ninth Circuit en banc decision from this year, and the court held that what I mentioned before, using prior compensation as a basis for discriminating in hiring, they said can't do that anymore. If you're going to pay the male and female differently for doing the same job, it has to be based on job-related issues. So, for example, if one person comes in with 25 years more experience than the junior person, that's a valid reason to pay them differently. If someone comes in with a relevant master's degree and someone else is just finishing up college, that's a relevant basis. But the fact that in a prior job, one was paid more than the other, that has no connection to the current employment, and the court rejected that. That's the law as it exists in the Ninth Circuit. This is not a nationwide interpretation of the Equal Pay Act, but we're seeing. Robin, do you want to talk about changes at the state level?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, so you've done a great job of talking about the challenges and framing for us what needed to happen, right? And I really appreciate you reminding us, right? Like that for its time, the Equal Pay Act was amazing, right? I remind myself about the Pregnancy Discrimination Act the same way, right? Like these were really significant changes at the time. And the world has evolved, and so many more women are in the workforce. I mean, there's just so many different things, right, that have happened. I think that what I've really seen in the last 20 years is more and more research to help focus on this question, right? Because so many people are like, well, there's a law against that, right? Why is it still happening, right? This is for everything, sexual harassment, equal pay. Like, I feel like we sit back and we're like, why aren't the tools that we have available working? And, so I think you've done a really good job of explaining, right, how limited as a litigator you are, and how frustrating it has to be. And so what's happened also, though, is we've seen increased research, and I can't say enough in the policy realm how necessary it is, right, to have research, right, that says not just anecdotally, but statistically that we know that the things we've been talking about remain profound barriers to equal pay, to transparency, for example, or basing wages, entry-level wages on what you were paid in your last job. I have to say that as a lawyer, I've experienced both of those things, right? So repeatedly, I learned years after I got hired as a lawyer that I got started at my starting salary was $10,000 to $15,000 less than males who started with the same level of experience. And I did not know. And I'm a public interest lawyer. I've never worked for a firm, so I'm outing my progressive sisters and brothers out there. Nobody gets a pass on this, right? And I would say, actually, in the nonprofit sector, the argument made to me was that they are under even more profound economic pressure, right, to make the dollar stretch. I mean, it's a really difficult space to think about, right? Because when I found out, first of all, that the argument was made to me, well, we're starting you this because this is what you told us on your application form that you made in your last job. I fought. And then when I had worked at a place for a period of time, and the only reason I knew was because I had to fundraise. And so I got my hands on the budget, right? And I looked at, and I literally, I screamed out loud, right? And I'm a workers' rights lawyer, sorry, and you can look at my background, right? This is what's so profound. I'm working for organizations my whole life who are fighting for this. Anyway, so I just want to say that this doesn't have any barriers based on race or class or ethnicity or education level. This happens to, I think there's a lot of myths out there about equal pay and the pay gap. And I just, want to commend those that came before me and did the research that has led to this wave. And I think of it as a wave. I don't know about you, Sue, but I see a wave of legislation in the last 5 or 6 years to really start examining and trying to pass laws that are targeting these particular barriers that you've shared with us, right? So the first one here is 13 states now have enacted legislation, right, that prohibits employers from asking for salary history, right? That's huge for me personally, just huge. And I now hire, I've hired for many, so I see this on all sides of the aisle, if that makes any sense. And it is really significant. And so, the hope is that this continues, we'll get federal legislation passed, but you would think this is a little thing, but it's a huge thing because that gave employers permission, right? To pay as, well, I'm paying you $5,000 more than you made in your last job. Aren't you happy? Kind of conversation. I literally had that conversation more than once. And then, got what you were describing, Sue, when I pushed back as I got older and said, well, wait a minute, what did you hire someone? I see you have a similar position, right? In the next program over that you just hired with someone my level of asking for the same level of experience. What did you pay that person? And they were offended. How dare I ask? Right? How dare I ask? And again, I'm having this conversation after I have the offer, importantly, but nonetheless, they're now oh my gosh, she's an uppity, bossy, all these words.
Any less because you have the job.
Right. It was just really profound. So this is significant. And then I think the next move that we've seen that's really significant is, that in this California leads so much on everything. And it's so important. I think, I lived in California. I was a baby lawyer in California. And I remember when people would say, oh, well, that's California. No one else is going to do that. And then I would remind them about the percentage of the population in the country that lives in the state of California, and so when you say that, the Ninth Circuit, I think about that too, right? Sue, that the cases you've just shared with us that are from this year, but the Ninth Circuit is not just California, right? It's a number of states and covers a huge percentage of the population in the country. So I think these are significant changes, and we often see other states, including New York, follow. So beginning with California now, in 2017, employers are now required to provide pay information to job applicants. So this is another thing, and I've actually pushed for this in places that I've worked. If you don't provide, well, this is the research has shown this, when there is no pay range provided, this is, and I confess that I undervalue myself, right? And this has been shown, based on race and ethnicity and gender, that we undervalue ourselves, right? And we don't know. And that men have no qualms for the reasons you've talked about, the cultural and the gender stereotypes and all the rest of it, asking for more money. And, I think in a false way, employers think they retain more flexibility and more power if they don't publish a pay range. And I actually don't think that's true. And what we know is when the pay range is provided, that we do see the pay gap, go away in these employers. And so, it's something. It's just, I can't say strongly enough, right? And you can do a pay range, right? That's the other thing I just want to say, right? Pay information does not mean doesn't mean that you just say you're going to pay whoever you hire, $42,000. That's not what that means, right? It means that you just outline the range and maybe some detail upon what you base your determination on in terms of where in the range, things like that. And we find that, non-white male applicants really utilize that information to their benefit. And it does really address the pay gap. And then the last thing is that states in their state legislation are moving away from what we started talking about at the beginning of this conversation, right? Which is this really narrow definition of equal pay for equal work, and moving toward in their legislation the model of comparable worth. And I think that's probably long term, and Sue, I'd be curious to hear what you think. I think long term, this is what's going to lead to the significant change, because it is going to allow us to tackle that underlying issue of how we value work and how we value occupations, right? And so you can dig into that, caregiver versus construction worker conversation. I think it's going to, I'd be curious as a litigator to think what it poses some challenges too. So I'd love to hear you explore that a little bit, because I think it offers some opportunity, but I think it also poses some challenges.
Yeah. Well, I agree 1,000%. And I think, it's going to start within, large corporations, right? So a large corporation has a janitor and a lady who works in the cafeteria.
Mm-hmm.
And, these sorts of jobs where you can compare and contrast the value of those jobs to the business enterprise itself, and you can begin to compare value, required skill sets, et cetera, between apples and oranges. And when we finally get to that apples to oranges comparison, even if we start within a corporation as opposed to, people who work in hospitals versus people who work on construction sites, that will take us a long way there, right? And the other thing I was going to say about something you said earlier, Robin, is about transparency in interviewing and knowing what the pay scale is. I've done some cases against universities for university professors, and everybody knows colleges and universities guard what they're paying their people like it's the crown jewels. You would think it would be. Some state schools are mandated to disclose that, but private institutions guard it like it is the crown jewels. And I have uncovered outrageous situations where, for example, a senior female tenured professor is paid less than a non-tenured track contract professor who's male, things of that sort. So, once you get into required transparency, you start to undermine the ability for the universities to do that. And I think a lot of that can happen. It's certainly discriminatory, but it's not like some dean saying, let's pay the women less. It's one decision that just gets on a life of its own. And maybe that's one dean, and 2 years later, they bring in somebody else. And maybe that's another dean that negotiates that. And maybe there are different negotiating styles involved, but all of a sudden, then you have a faculty where when you look at the pay differentials, it makes absolutely no sense, right? Except that there's a huge gender disparity.
Yeah, I personally experienced this. I taught, I was a tenure track law professor at the University of North Dakota, which is a Sunshine State. So total transparency, no pay gap, right? And you would, I would just say, I think stereotypically people would think North Dakota, really? Yes. Because people would perceive that to be very progressive. And for them, it was, and we were a Sunshine State. I knew that my salary was published and everyone else's was. So I looked because I had already, as I've described, experienced discrimination on this basis previously, but I looked and I absolutely got paid the same, right, as my peers at the same level. And I think, so that's really interesting and makes what you described so even more unbelievable to me. And, I had friends, there's the case at the University of Denver, right? The law professors at the University of Denver, they filed a lawsuit for equal pay and surfaced some of the very issues that you described. And so it is, and it goes on, it's been going on for decades, as you said, and that amounts to a lot of money when you've got somebody, thanks to the Lilly Ledbetter case, who's been for 20 years, right?
Well, think of all the money that's not going into their pension programs because it wasn't part of their base, or the bonuses that they've lost because it wasn't part of their base.
Yeah.
It's billions of dollars in the U.S. economy every year that pay differential is costing women. Annually, it's billions, right? Yeah. And some people, I looked before this presentation for some statistics of what it is per worker, and anywhere from $400,000 to $2 million over the course of a lifespan. It's huge. It's, we say 80 cents on the dollar and it's like 20 cents. It's sort of like, once you play the numbers out over the course of lifetime. It's life, this is money that you can buy a house with, put your kids through college, inherited wealth, etc. It's huge.
Yeah, certainly possibly life-changing.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So Robin, do you have some statistics or some information for us on what's going on in the rest of the world?
Yes, I do. If I can get to the next slide. Sorry. My computer has decided. Thank you. Sorry. So again, contextualizing the United States globally is always useful. And so there's an Equal Pay International Coalition, EPIC is what it goes by, that is led by the International Labor Organization, UN Women, and OECD. And, this is a really unique coalition. And it was formed not too long ago specifically to achieve equal pay for women and men everywhere. Now, I just want to flag the binary there for a minute. I would probably say for all genders, right? But particularly really focusing on the pay gap that we've been talking about here. And what makes it unique is governments are members, like the Canadian government, unions are members, and huge corporations, right, are members. And that's because all of these different entities have decided that this is actually hurting their economy overall. Because part of what we have touched on, but I think not really talked about too much, is it's not just the lost wages to the individual, but women drop out of the workforce, as you were saying earlier, because of COVID. This has been exacerbated, Sue. But generally, like I've seen during COVID an exacerbated version of, in heterosexual couples where the man and the woman sit down and they look at how much they make, right? Which is caused by the things we're talking about here. And they look at their bottom line, and somebody needs to stay home and take care of the kids and do that job, right? That doesn't pay. And it's going to be the woman more often than the man, even if the man actually wants to stay home and care for the kids because they love it more. Like I give the example of my sister and brother-in-law all the time this way, right? Like my brother-in-law would have loved to have stayed home with the kids, right? But he made more. It never, ever was going to make sense. And so I think we really have to recognize that it really has these larger, profound impacts if through our lives, women continue to make less. And so as a result, we lose those women in the workforce. And what these corporations, right, and what these countries have identified is, wow, that's really bad for our bottom line, right? Like as a society, we have to address this. And I think we're going to hopefully see more and more. And I think that's related to the data that I was talking about. Again, like the ILO has recently done these reports that really pull out what I've just described, that the impact is not limited to the individual woman, right? There's no such thing. That affects the whole community, the family, right? The GDP, all of it. And so this to me is really exciting. And I would love, and I know there's some work like this going on in the United States, but I think if we could do more, it would really be profound. The other thing is they launched, for the first time, we talked about equal pay days in the United States and how in the last 10 years, we've seen this evolution from, there used to just be one, in case you're wondering, and that was really for white women versus white men. Let's just be transparent about it. And it was much earlier in the year, right? But now that we are really highlighting throughout the year the intersectional approach to this, we see that increased awareness. And it's less and less easy to deny that this has incredible detrimental impacts to our society. Now we have an International Pay Day, and that's something that, they just had a webinar a couple of weeks ago, high profile speakers, including the soccer player from the women's soccer team that but last year won the World Cup, talking, because they brought that big lawsuit, right? The women's US soccer team. And, so I was really impressed. And I think all of these things are changes on the horizon. The other thing is that Iceland and Germany and other countries are really taking the lead on the very things that we're talking about on this phone call. They have passed legislation now several years ago, and so they're tracking its impact that requires all the things that we talked about that the state laws that I described are requiring, right? They require transparency. They don't fire people if they talk about their wages, right? So that's a different issue that Sue mentioned. It's one thing to say that they have to publish how much they're going to pay you in the job announcement. It's another thing to say that that chilling effect, right, goes away, so that you can actually, and in fact, there's an exploration of encouraging that, right? Encouraging people to disclose. And maybe, there's been some discussions about posting it. the other thing is that in Iceland and Germany, there is now data requirements, right? So the governments are now requiring employers of a certain size or larger to provide data annually that proves that they've addressed their pay gap, right? So they recognize you starting at a certain place where there was a pay gap based on gender and race and ethnicity, right? And that over time, you're going to have to rectify that. And so, it talks about having to make progress. And there's significant penalties if you don't do it. So that's the other thing. There's a lot of arguments to be made that these are all wonderful ideas, but if all, a big corporation has to do is pay a fine of $3,000, who cares, right? The fines are much more significant. And then the last thing that I would say is that these governments have invested in staff and entities within their national government, right, that is dedicated just to this issue, right, to really focusing on this issue, to collecting this data, to analyzing this data, to publishing this data. And that's why we're seeing the pay gap really, really be addressed in the ways that we're talking about on this call. So as someone who works exclusively in the Global South, I have to tell you that I haven't seen the impact of this, right, among the workers that I represent in my organization works with. So garment workers, agricultural workers, mostly informal workers, right? And I think one of the biggest question marks for me as I look at all of this is that 90% outside of, globally, 90% of workers are now what we call informal workers. And what that means is they're not employees. So they're not entitled to protection from minimum wage and overtime laws. They're not entitled to protection from equal pay laws. They're not entitled to protection from sexual harassment or anti-gender-based violence and harassment laws. And all of that contributes to the pay gap, right? Like all of that, because we know that the vast majority of informal workers are also women. And so what I'm really focused on is expanding these protections to all workers, right? This understanding of how work has evolved so that these protections aren't limited to, exclusively full-time, right? The male model, right? We all, as Joan Williams has taught us all, right? The male model of the worker, right? Which is you get up in the morning in your suit from the 1950s and you work from 9 to 5. But our laws are globally still designed around that. So for me, I'm excited about, the ongoing dialogue in this space, but also really having it match up to the realities of what the workforce looks like, both domestically and globally. And those conversations have started, but I'm really excited to see them continue and expand.
It's all very exciting. So what has to happen? Where do we go from here? It's 2020 now, and women are an important part of the workforce, certainly in the United States and other places. And we're not doing it to earn our jewelry money right now. We're doing it to support our families and to have a better life for our kids. And there are certainly many, single parent homes. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of good news. I just alluded to some on the global level. Probably a lot of the folks joining us today are familiar with the Paycheck Fairness Act. It actually just moved and was passed by the House, so it's gotten some recent attention. But the Paycheck Fairness Act was introduced into Congress to address a lot of the things that we're talking about, right? The limitations that Sue has identified and shared from her experience as a litigator. So no retaliation for coworkers discussing pay, no basing pay upon higher and prior earning history, pay data collection. I just alluded to that. That's another form of transparency that's really critical. And actually, the previous presidential administration through the EEOC actually moved in a direction toward that. And I was working the Obama administration at the time and was involved in that. And now that's not happening. But, that's just the Paycheck Fairness Act, if it were passed by the Senate, as it has been by the House and then signed by the president, would make that possible. And it also closes this loophole that Sue has alluded to, right, in the affirmative defense, which is this factor other than sex. And now the defense would have to be a pay practice that is job related and consistent with business necessity. And I didn't know, Sue, if you wanted to say more about how critical that is from your perspective handling these cases.
Absolutely. And, we are seeing the movement in the courts. Like I mentioned, the Rizzo Ninth Circuit decision, but that should be a nationwide issue. And hopefully with legislation, we can get there. And the other possible legislation is the Fair Pay Act. This is even broader and or sort of more revolutionary perhaps than the Paycheck Fairness Act. So this is the Fair Pay Act would be moving the Equal Pay Act from where we started with equal pay for equal worth or equal work, more to the equal pay for work that is of comparable worth to the organization. So it's intra-organizational as the bill is currently written. But again, if a corporation has a secretary, a female secretary, and a male guy who works in the mailroom, it's going to have to do an analysis if it wants to justify how it ends up paying the guy in the mailroom more than the secretary. It's certainly possible, but the corporation is thereby required to look at what skill sets are required for each of these positions. What responsibilities do they have, and are some of them, more substantial? Does one supervise and one not? Does one work graveyard shift and one not? Does one have to lift 100 pounds? But it's doing that type of analysis to justify pay differentials, which since right now, that's completely arbitrary and employer discretion when you're talking about two different jobs. The Fair Pay Act would take us a really long way toward getting at the differential pay that's caused by job segregation, right? So, the secretarial pool and the traditional models like that, we're going to be able to start examining those skill sets and comparing them to traditional male roles in the same organizations and making sure there's comparable pay there. It would be absolutely terrific if they could pass the Fair Pay Act. I wanted to maybe end on the notion, here we are in the middle of this global pandemic. COVID has set women back, as I mentioned earlier, but it has the possibility for some changes that could be long-lasting and could be beneficial to women. And there's two I'm thinking of. The first one is that while women are still shouldering the majority of the childcare obligations, men are picking up more in this pandemic than they ever did before. And there tends to, if you read the economists and the sociologists who look to that, once they've assumed that responsibility, it doesn't go away as quickly as once we have a vaccine. The normative gender values actually evolve. And then if you look to the generation of the children who are going to have, experiences during this pandemic and experience daddy, teaching them or cooking for them or doing the laundry for them or whatever it is, those changing roles are going to become normal for those children, and we're going to see changes in the future. So that's one possible, I call these COVID blessings. Can we look on the bright side of it?
I love it. We have to find the silver lining in there somewhere.
Right. And then the second one, which I think is even more significant, and I have to tell you, I'm a little bit guilty of this myself. So I manage my office, my law firm, and I tended to be a person who thought, a lot of these jobs, you really have to be in the office on a consistent basis to do this. And you have to be in the city, and you have to, well, as we all know, for white collar work, the type of work where you need a phone and internet connection and a laptop, it's challenging all those assumptions. So Robin's point about, the traditional male role, if he puts on his suit and he gets his briefcase and he goes off to work, the pandemic has turned that entirely upside down. Mm-hmm. Corporations are saying over and over again that they don't see ever going back to the workforce they had before, where everybody comes in and works 9 to 5 in the office. And that flexibility on hours, flexibility on whether you're home doing work or you're in the office, has to provide much more opportunities for pink collar workers. It's just going to be a beneficial thing particularly for working moms. Robin, I don't know if you have thoughts on the how COVID will change our lives. But those are two I think of maybe possibilities for positive things.
I'm going to jump in with the CLE code. That is J as in justice, B as in Brown, the number 5, the number 5. I'm going to repeat this 2 more times, so please write this down if you are seeking CLE credit. It is J as in justice, B as in Brown, 5, 5, and one final time, JB 5, 5.
Pick up on your second point. And I love the way you talked about it as a blessing, because in my work, we've been struggling because the word that keeps slipping out is opportunity, which is just like, how can you talk like that, in this moment of crisis and trio of crises, right? Like economic crisis, health crisis, and a care crisis. These are all happening at once. But the flexibility that we have seen that employers are learning doesn't result in a significant drop in productivity. I mean, I think all of these fears have gone away. And I would say related to that is also the recognition that people will, that it's okay if they work from 9 to midnight, depending upon what the job is, if they have other care responsibilities in the middle of the day. And I think this has really catapulted that understanding. And I'm hopeful that will stick around, but, it's hard to know. I think the other thing is, that this narrative around essential workers, right? Because such a high percentage of essential workers are women and people of color. And, having an open dialogue about like, sure, we're going to call you essential and we're still going to pay you nothing, right? Like really, I see much more conversation about that.
A little bit of a disconnect there.
Exactly. And again, so many of those essential workers goes back to that piece I was talking about before, which is they are not full-time employees necessarily, right? So this gets into this conversation about who do these equal pay laws protect? And if we continue to see a push in the workforce, and we are, I mean, this is the trajectory that's been going on now for many years, the increasing percentage of the workforce that is not, right, an employee, then we need to really examine how we're going to push that needle around equal pay. If we recognize, because that's another form of occupational segregation, right? Is that we recognize that the vast majority of people in these non-standard, and there's all this vocabulary used to describe this non-traditional, non-standard, informal. I hate gig, like that's another one. I don't like that term because we've had gig workers, since before I was born. We're just using that label. But they're independent contractors, right? A lot of them. And so, or they're being misclassified as such. And we really have to have that be a part of this conversation. And I have to say, for the first time in a long time, I am seeing that, right? And, just for example, the very first economic package passed by Congress for the first time expanded access to unemployment insurance benefits, right, to this broader spectrum of workers, to independent, what we would call independent contractors. It just recognized for the first time, which was a nightmare for the unemployment insurance systems. But importantly, and I think that is a recognition of what we're talking about, right, is that those are all workers. They all deserve access to protections. And so I spend a lot of time in that space, right, in my day job globally, is looking at kind of how work is structured and how work is structured is related to how people are paid. And that needs to be a part of this equal pay conversation as well. Because if we keep focusing on equal pay for people in what we call traditional employee jobs, we're not actually going to move the dial for those who need it the most. And so the silver lining I see, if there is such a thing, is that people are willing to have that conversation more than I've ever seen before in my years of advocacy around this.
Thank you both for a really fascinating review of a difficult and interesting subject. Certainly, I am coming away more enlightened than I started. And again, I just want to thank you both very much for being with us today.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you.